Great. Well, let's make a start. Let me begin with a question, as I often do. Question this morning is this: what do the Navy SEALs, Manchester United under Alex Ferguson, and the Beatles all have in common? Any thoughts? Okay. They are all outstanding examples, I think, and if you're not a Man United fan, you might disagree with this, of teamwork. Say teamwork. Of togetherness. Of the way in which a group of individuals with their own individual strengths can come together to create a kind of critical mass. The Navy SEALs, this elite American water-based special forces unit who work together in task units of 32, apparently platoons of 16, teams of 4, and then swim buddies as teams of 2. In their training, focus an awful lot of time on developing a sense of what you might call togetherness, so that when they are on a mission together, they can literally move forward in unity with one another and communicate with one another without ever speaking a word. Just by a hand signal, a little raised eyebrow or whatever. There's such a sense that they have trained together to develop such a deep sense of togetherness that there's almost this instinctive sense of unity with one another as they go about their mission. Navy SEALs. I can't really comment on Man United under Alex Ferguson, not being a big football fan, but Alex Ferguson was very well known for the focus he put on teamwork. And in fact, beyond just the men's first team, the entire kind of community of the club itself, Man United, and very, very well known for the importance that he put on teamwork. And then, of course, the Beatles. Some of you might be old enough to remember the Beatles. My dad saw the Beatles live on one occasion. Incredible. I grew up hearing Beatles LPs being played by my dad. But the Beatles, of course, such a blend of amazingly gifted individuals with their songwriting, with their musical talent, coming together to produce something that of course, was outstanding in terms of their sound. And I don't know if any of you have ever get the opportunity to watch the Get Back kind of extended documentary. It'll probably take you about a week to watch it because it is literally hours and hours and hours and hours long. This rediscovered footage of the Beatles collaborating together and creating some of the songs that we would know them for. And fascinating documentary, just a fly on the wall. And what came through for me watching that was just these are just friends together, bringing who they are into the mix, collaborating together. So I want to speak this morning as we continue our series on Together on a Mission, on the together of Together on a Mission, because God has called us not just on a mission as individuals, but on a mission together. The strapline under the title of this series, Together on a Mission, is People, Partnership and Purpose. So last week we looked at people, this week I'm looking at partnership. We looked last week at how the New Testament mission that we're called to is all about people. People are the plan. People with names. People with what we might call individuality. People with different personalities, people with different backgrounds, and people with their own particular gifts. And that might lead us wrongly to assume and conclude that New Testament mission is all about great individuals doing great individual exploits. Heroes of the faith doing extraordinary things on their own, trailblazing away ahead of others. Unusual, extraordinary individuals. But that is not what we find, I would suggest, in the New Testament. Instead, what we find are individuals with all their differences joined together in partnership and unified around a single mission. The story of New Testament mission is the story of individuals together on a mission. And I think this is illustrated more clearly than anywhere else in the ministry of Paul the Apostle. Outside of the Gospels, of course, Paul is the one single individual that we have most information about in the New Testament, right the way through particularly the second half of Acts, but also, of course, through all the letters that he wrote. And what some people mistakenly imagine as they read about the ministry of Paul is that this is some kind of Lone Ranger man on a mission. And that is not at all the case. In fact, we rarely ever find Paul acting alone on mission in the New Testament. He is always with a team. Someone has estimated that there are around 90 individuals in the New Testament who were in some capacity or other co-workers with Paul, and some of them are specifically called that. Paul uses that phrase, co-worker. There's a lot of what we might call teamwork in New Testament mission. In the record of Paul's travels as an apostle in Acts, we find him then always traveling and ministering in the context of a team. Those teams were actually quite flexible. They weren't like institutional teams that were set in stone for the whole of his ministry and mission. They would change for a whole range of reasons. And like I said, Paul rarely ever is found doing mission on his own. The one notable exception, I think, is in Acts 17 in Athens. You can look at that later in the book of Acts, chapter 17. And there Paul has been in a place called Thessalonica, sharing the gospel as usual, seeing a response to the gospel, but then facing some very threatening kickback from that, disturbance. A mob that gathers and attacks those who have become believers. And in that situation, Paul and Silas, who were on that mission trip together, are whisked off by boat during the night to a place called Berea, where they continue to go about gospel mission. But the mob from Thessalonica follow them to Berea. And once again, there's a situation that is just a crisis, urgent, immediate situation. And so they put Paul on a boat by himself, and he travels over to Athens to defuse the situation. And there in Athens, while Paul is waiting for his co-workers to arrive, he gets so agitated by what he sees in Athens that he just begins to engage in gospel mission and ministry. And it's the only time, as far as I can tell in the book of Acts, that we ever see Paul going about gospel mission on his own. He was that committed to teamwork. There's another very interesting occasion that Paul refers to in 2 Corinthians 2. You can look at that again later. It's in verse 12 to 14. I'm going to read it in a moment. And 2 Corinthians is a letter that is written to explain and defend his approach to gospel mission as an apostle. And in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12 to 13, we have a very insightful little window into a moment in his ministry. And it says this, he says in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12, "When I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ." Now the background there is Paul has been again in Ephesus for some time, preaching the gospel. There's been an uproar in the city, and once again, Paul has had to flee. I think one church leader said, "It seems to me that everywhere Paul went, there was either a revival or a riot. And everywhere I go, they just offer me a cup of tea." Paul has to flee Ephesus, and he has an opportunity on his journey out to visit this place, Troas, to share the gospel. And this is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12. "When I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was opened for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest, because I did not find my brother Titus there. And so I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia." What an interesting little insight into the way that Paul thought about his gospel mission and went about his ministry. He's left Ephesus. God has opened a door for him in Troas. He's hoping to find his brother Titus there. But for whatever reason, we don't know what, he's not there. And so what does Paul do? He moves on. He was that committed to doing mission together with others that he does not step through the door of opportunity that God's given him, because there was no brother beside him to do ministry and mission with. So this hopefully is opening your eyes a little bit to the importance of togetherness and partnership in mission. Paul models what is at the heart of New Testament mission, the central place of partnership. We are not called and commissioned as individuals to embrace and carry out God's mission. We are called together on a mission. So how does that work out? Let's think this morning. I want to talk about three ways, but the main focus is really on the first two. So please don't get concerned by the time I get to the end of the second one and think I'm going to spend the same amount of time on the first one. How does this work out? Three ways. Number one, within the local church. This is where our primary partnerships are located. In the New Testament, everyone that responded individually to the gospel message of what God had done in and through Christ was then added, say added to a local church community. Acts 2 sets the precedent for that. And that continues to be the case all the way through Acts. Now, sometimes from time to time, of course, people were redeployed from one place to another. Sometimes that was for practical reasons. They may be, it may be business, it may be trade, it may be some other practical reason. Sometimes it was a result, actually, of forced migration. So Acts 11, we read of the believers in Jerusalem scattered as a result of persecution. We read later in the book of Acts of a couple, we're going to look at them on one of these mornings, Priscilla and Aquila, who are driven out of Rome by Claudius, along with all the other Jews at that time. So there is some practical redeployment that happens from time to time, forced redeployment that happens from time to time, and then also we find some translocal ministry going on. So these are individuals who, with teams, will move around from place to place in order to plant and serve local churches. Paul would fit into that category, although Paul very clearly had what you might call a base church in Antioch that he went from and that he returned to. But apart from those instances of redeployment, forced migration, and traveling ministries, people who responded to the gospel became embedded within local church communities. The only Christians in the New Testament who found themselves outside of the community of the local church were Christians who were under church discipline. And the aim of that experience of discipline was that their experience of living as a disciple without the benefits that come spiritually from being embedded in a local church community would be so painful to them that they would come to their senses and repent and be restored and readmitted to the local church community. Do you understand? So there was no such thing in the New Testament as what you might call self-isolation from the local church. No such thing as floating in an unaccountable way from one church community to another. To be a disciple meant to be an embedded part of a local church community. It meant to be a functioning member of a body of people with whom you were together on a mission. Being a disciple and making disciples is something we can only do alongside others. Discipleship is a team activity. You remember what Jesus said to the first disciples. What did he say? He said, "Follow me, and what? And I will make you fishers of men." What do you think that meant for Simon Peter, hearing Jesus, for John, for the others? What did it mean to follow Jesus and become a fisher of people? I don't know about you, but for many of us, we think of fishing as a bit of a recreational activity, don't we? We think maybe of sitting on a camping chair in front of your own stretch of water 20 meters away from the nearest other fisherman with a single rod and a single line and a keep net. I spent a good slice of my childhood doing that. Dad was a very keen angler. Is that what would have come to mind? I will make you fishers of men. Here you are, here's your swim, here's your rod and line, here's your keep net. I'll see you in 3 hours. No. For them, fishing meant working with other people. It meant being part of a team, in a boat, with nets. And it was far from a hobby. It was their livelihood. It was a daily activity. No fish, no food on the table, no roof over their heads. It was something they did with others. And in one sense, it was for them impossible to fish alone. You needed a team. Think about all the things that might be part and parcel of fishing in that way. Navigation. Keeping an eye on the weather. Deciding where to throw the nets today. The throwing of the nets. The hauling in of the nets. The mending. The maintaining of the nets. The mending and the maintaining of the boat. And then, of course, there was the whole very pragmatic business side of things. Selling the fish, recording the income, paying the team, investing in more equipment. This was team business. And discipleship and making disciples is a team business. We're called together on mission. You get the picture. Making disciples, then, is what we do with others in our local church. It's serious business. It's not recreational. It's not a hobby on a Sunday. It's what we do wherever we are, but it's what we do together. And in the course of making disciples, as in the course of fishing in a boat with a team of people, there are all sorts of things that need doing, all sorts of things, some of them very pragmatic, that contribute to that mission that we are on together. And so we need, of course, all the gifts that God distributes within the body of the church, so that we can grow to be an effective body of people working out God's mission in our context. And so as we begin this year and we think again about what God is calling us to, as we look to employ this facility of mission to be increasingly fruitful, I want to remind us that we are called together on this. I want to suggest that you're not here by random. The Bible speaks about God arranging the members in the body. We don't just fall into a local church by accident. Now, there's obviously a process we go through. But there should be that sense of God having arranged the members. We're here by appointment. We're here by God's design. And so we have a part to play. But it's a part that we play alongside others. So the local church then is the first and primary way in which we work out this togetherness on a mission. And there is much that God has called us to. And there are a whole range of gifts that we need in order to be effective in what God has called us to in this place. The second way in which we find partnership worked out in the New Testament is what I would describe as with a wider family of churches. May not be immediately obvious to you. The local church is the primary place where our partnership in mission is worked out. But the New Testament, I believe, reflects a scenario where local churches participate with other local churches in a broader shared mission through the ministry of apostles and their teams. Explain what I mean by that. So whilst local churches take full ownership for God's mission within their own local context, within their towns, their regions, they don't become isolated or parochial or what we might call independent in the process. Through their relationship with the traveling ministries, they remain connected to a bigger picture and a bigger mission. They enjoy a partnership that goes beyond their own context and beyond the boundaries of their own primary mission field. So Paul will write to the Philippians in Philippians 1 and 3 and 5, and he'll say, I give thanks to my God for every remembrance of you, praying with joy for you in every prayer, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Paul is writing those words 10 years after he planted the church in Philippi. I mean, he moved on from Philippi several years before that. And yet he's able to say to them, you are continuing to be in partnership with me on mission. 10 years later. So there's a sense in which the local church in Philippi, through their relationship with Paul as an apostle, are continuing to be together on a mission with him. And with all the implications of that, reaching into new places. In 2 Corinthians, again, a letter where Paul gives us a window into so much of his approach. You can look at this later, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 13 to 16. Paul speaks to the local church in Corinth, and he speaks of how through their relationship with him, he is hoping as they grow in their faith that he will then be able to move to regions beyond. He says these words, "We're not overextending ourselves as if we'd not reached you, since we come to you with the gospel of Christ, and we're not boasting beyond measure about other people's labors. On the contrary, we hope that as your faith increases, our area of ministry will be greatly enlarged so that we may preach the gospel to the regions beyond you." There's a partnership going on there that leads to not just local ministry in Corinth, but regions beyond being reached, other places hearing the gospel. And it's the partnership between the local church and the apostle and his team that's at the center of that gospel expansion. Romans 15, verse 23 to 28. I won't read that, but you can look at it yourself. Paul's talking about how he wants to go to Rome in order that the Roman Christians can then be a partner with him as he then goes beyond them to Spain. And he calls them to be part of that ministry. He's catching them up in his mission. So the scenario we find in the New Testament is of local churches, not isolated, not independent, not just parochial, focusing on their own primary mission field, but in partnership with apostles and their teams, and so involved in a dynamic, growing, beyond their own borders mission. But some of those churches were churches that Paul personally planted and had a very strong historic relationship. Others were relating to Paul through his team members, through what you might call his co-workers. Some of them, like Colossae, it seems, never even saw Paul face to face. But he considers them to be part of this family of churches that he is relating to. You understanding what I'm saying? So let me ask you a question. In 2 Corinthians 11, when Paul speaks of the pressures of his apostolic ministry and refers to his concern for all the churches, does he mean there every church in existence? And if not, what's he referring to? And I would suggest he doesn't mean every church on the face of the earth at that point in time. All the churches means all the churches that he's got a personal relational involvement with. A group, a family of churches that all have some measure of relationship with Paul and his team and are caught up together. And he carries a concern for that family of churches as an apostle. Elsewhere, he speaks, of course, of not building on another man's foundation. So there were other foundations in other churches and places that others had built. And he's clear there that he's called and responsible for his own sphere of ministry, you might call it. So what did that relationship look like? And what does that mean for us as we look to work this out in our own context? It was a relationship that was first and foremost very personal, not professional. It involved a lot of affection. Just read the way that Paul speaks of how he feels about these churches that he's in relationship with. Sometimes real joy over the great things that are happening amongst them. Sometimes real deep pain over some of the problems that were happening. This isn't some kind of professional network of churches. This is a family of churches, and Paul sees himself as something of a father. And he feels the emotional weight that comes from being personally in relationship with those churches. Often, of course, mentioning people by name within the local churches that he writes to. Genuine friendships and relationships. It wasn't institutional, it was relational. So it was personal. It was secondly pastoral. Paul speaks of his care for the churches, describes himself at one time as a nursing mother, at other times of having to administer some correction. It was pastoral, it was doctrinal, it involved teaching, as Paul explained and underlined the truths of the gospel, and actually at times, sometimes addressed false teaching within those churches that he was in relationship with. It was prayerful. Paul often speaks of how he prays for these local churches that he relates to. And he asks them to pray for him in his mission and ministry. It was next cross-cultural. These were churches that were, they weren't all in one single region. They were across the then known world, representing all sorts of different cultures, made up of people from a whole range of different ethnicities. And so there was a cross-cultural element to this. And then finally, it was strategic. Often Paul would send people from one context into another. Titus to Crete, Timothy to Ephesus. And so we see then not just a kind of local partnership together on mission in the local church, but a partnership between the local church and a wider family of churches through, in this case, the Apostle Paul and his team. And I think there are some very real benefits of that. The local church remains connected to a bigger vision, a bigger picture of God's mission, and is helped to not become very parochial, which can happen. The local church and its eldership are cared for. It's one of the roles that Paul had, caring, gathering at times the elders of a local church like Ephesus to encourage them. The local church had the opportunity to receive the input of some of these traveling gifts rather than just having the gifts within its own local congregation. We've got two friends coming over the next season in the spring. John Groves, that I know many of you know. Chris Kilby from Southampton will be with us on a Sunday morning. These are opportunities to draw on the input of mature gifts that we do not have within our own local congregation. And they bring a perspective that it's difficult for us to have within the local congregation. It means, of course, that there are some very helpful guardrails in terms of teaching and what you might call our doctrine. It means that the local church is involved in mission beyond its own primary mission field. It means that the local church benefits from being part of a family of churches which is made up of other cultures as well. So there are all sorts of benefits in this partnership. And so the question is, how does that work out for us? Well, it's very simple. It works out through our relationship with what is called commission, which is just a name for a team and teams of people who are looking to work this out in our day and situation. It means that we're part of a family of churches and that we have relationships with people beyond the boundaries of our own local congregation that play this kind of role to encourage us in our life together and in our mission together as a local church. So that's the second layer of partnership. The third one I'm literally just going to mention, which is, of course, with the whole body of Christ. The sense in which we have brothers and sisters all over the world in all sorts of different contexts, from all sorts of different traditions, with whom, in a very broad sense, we are, of course, in our moment of history, together on a mission with. And of course, that works out within our own town in the context of what we call churches together in Eastleigh. We've got an opportunity in a couple of weeks to gather with other local churches, great local churches, from a whole range of different traditions in our own town. The broader body of Christ we are, of course, connected to. So let's think about some application, and then we're going to break bread. So how do we work this out then? First of all, by being a member. If the local church is the primary place where we work out our partnership, then we need to be members of a local church. Not attendees, not spectators, but members. Not just saved, but saved and added. Not just on a list of names. That's not what I mean by membership. We don't actually have a list of members in that sense. We have a record of regular attendees. It's an administrative tool. But membership is not being a name on a list. Membership is being an embedded, participating part of a local church community. That's membership. Connected relationally, present, engaged when the church gathers, bringing who we are to the mix. Our gifts, our resources, playing our part. I wonder if that describes you. We all need to be somewhere embedded. And it may not be here. It may be one of the other local churches that we work with within our town. But I would suggest that this is the New Testament standard, that we're all members. So be a member. Secondly, be a team player. New Testament mission, as we've seen, is not DIY. It's not do it yourself. It's DIWO. Do it with others. Do it with others. Like Paul, who just refused to step through that open door of ministry because his brother Titus was not there. Now, that's not always practical. It's not always possible. Wherever it is possible, I think we need to look to do things with others. We had a great team day yesterday with Chris Kilby. Spent a whole day together, our wider team. Myself, Dan, Sean, Chris, and sadly Keith couldn't be there. He was not well. Team. Pray with others. Study the Bible with others. Do mission with others. Eat meals with others. Serve the poor with others. Do practical tasks with others. I wonder if there's anything that you're currently doing alone that you could do with others. Just think about that. We think about how this applies. Be a team player. Thirdly, be ready for some scrapes and some sparks. It can sound wonderful, can't it? Together on mission. In theory. The reality is, as we saw last week, this isn't partnership with lovely, gracious, mature Christians who are into the very things that you're into and see things in the way that you see them. No, this is partnership with people who are different, people who have different personalities, people who have different backgrounds, people who have different gifts, people who have different perspectives, and of course, people that have different problems to the problems that you have. And so that means that together on mission inevitably means that there will be from time to time opportunities for some scrapes and some sparks. Proverbs talks about iron sharpening iron. I don't know if you've ever tried to sharpen iron with iron. It may be actually a picture of iron in a forge. And so that's part and parcel of what it means for us to be together on mission. But you find that even in the ministry of the Apostle Paul, his working relationship with Barnabas, a disagreement over John Mark. You find it through Paul's letters, Euodia and Syntyche, two women who were co-workers with Paul who fell out with one another and just seemed unable to sort their problems out. Paul appeals to them. Be ready for some scrapes. Thirdly, be completely humble and patient. I think if there's one character quality that's needed more than any other for us to work effectively together, it's that of humility. Interestingly, in Ephesians chapter 4, that's how Paul begins as he begins to apply the wonderful truth of who we are together in Christ as this one new man. Be completely humble and gentle, patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Romans 12, again, in the context of describing the great variety of gifts that God's given us, Paul says this: do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Humility is the character cement that holds us together, that maintains the unity of the Spirit as we go about mission together. Humility is simply recognizing your own limits and your need of help in ways that you invite others and draw on the gifts of others in the course of mission. Gentleness, it means treating people with sensitivity. Kindness in the course of mission. Patience means that you stick with people and support people in the course of mission. That famous African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So God's called and commissioned us, with all our differences, to be unified in his mission. This is the together of together on a mission. And we're going to express that just as we bring things to an end in the last 5 minutes or so, by breaking bread together. The Bible speaks of the way in which we are one loaf. We who are many different types, many different backgrounds, many different gifts. But we who are many, we are one loaf. And so as we break bread, one of the things that we're doing is reminding ourselves and acknowledging that Christ's brokenness has brought about our unity, has brought about our togetherness, and that we are in this together because we are in Christ together. So what I'd like us to do is to take some bread